The second learning unit in understanding hazardous materials management is to break down the major acts which are enforced by certain agencies through the use of their regulations. So there are many different ways in which hazardous materials can be managed, but we're going to look, or at least begin looking at, we'll look at the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, Clean Air, Clean Water Act, as well as release and reporting rules. Then Department of Labor, working with Department of Transportation, moving, and then now I'm sure you are all of the age to remember conjunction junction, which was I'm just a bill, just an ordinary bill, and I'm stuck here on Capitol Hill. Well, I think you understand that bills become acts, and acts give authority or direction to certain agencies. And the acts also give the agencies the ability to write and enforce regulations. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act is which empowered the Department of Labor's secretary to establish an Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which then has different rules which are followed. And we're not going to get into government, but just so you understand that if for every act there's a overall department or agency that's responsible and that administers the rules.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed.
There are many different government entities that regulate hazardous materials, as well as those, of course, on the state and local level or within a certain industry. So one way to do it is to break it into 5 categories. We have consumer products, which include cosmetics, drugs, and alcohol. We have wastes, whether they're solid wastes or liquid wastes or air wastes into the atmosphere. And then we have chemicals in the workplace, transportation, and energy. So again, if we break them into these 5 categories, it's a lot easier to start to look at which specific agencies are responsible. So we don't deal very much with consumer waste in this class, we don't deal with consumer products in this class. We will look at wastes and however that is RECRA, which is definitely a different type of hazardous materials management. Here we're going to spend most of our time on workplace and transportation of, and Department of Energy has completely their own rules. And so there are 9 federal bodies responsible for the enforcement of the hazardous materials rules and regulations. So we have EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, Department of the Interior, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services. The DoD has their own rules. There are, at a minimum, 22 acts that govern hazardous materials. So again, this can be really overwhelming. The important lesson is which agency do you look to find the rules for which you will need. And so we're just going to start all at a basic level. The Code of Federal Regulations is basically all the rules for the United States of America. It gives different entities, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, a authority to write rules and create other sub-entities. Each title is updated every other year, and the title bears the name of the agency. So, for example, you're used to 29 CFR, which is 29 is the title for the Department of Labor. And so 29 CFR, again, is the chapter where you'll find rules, and it gives the Secretary the authorization to create the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. When looking at hazardous materials, most everything comes down to hazard communication standard and using the globalized system appropriately as far as labeling and classifications of hazardous materials. And so the label that you see for ammonia, each and every detail is specified by the 29 CFR chapter, which looks at the hazardous communication standard, and we'll look at that in detail as we get on with the course. So the hazardous communication standard is well documented and communicated through the Occupational Safety and Health Standards, 29 CFR. The main purpose is to inform people of the hazards, reduce the amount of waste, communicate hazards to the entire population, as well as proper labeling and safety data sheets. And each one of these is detailed in the standard itself, and we'll do some exercises so you can be familiar with labeling that meets the regulations, as well as labeling that may not meet the regulations. The main areas that we will be studying in this class are 29 CFR 1910 1200, which is the hazard communication standard, as well as 1910 subpart Z, which where we find our permissible exposure limits, 29 CFR subpart I for personal protective equipment, and as seen here, 29 CFR 1910-120, hazardous waste operations and emergency response. A lot of organizations or entities skip 120 because they think that they are not involved in a hazardous waste operation, where in fact you may have a release where you have people inside of your organization who respond, and therefore they would need to be trained to the level of the hazardous ops standard. Hazardous Materials Transportation Act, HMTA, is the principal law in the regulation of hazardous materials as they are transported. Its purpose is to protect against the risk of life, property, and the environment that are inherent in the transportation of hazardous materials over our intrastate, interstate, and as well as when involved in foreign commerce. The act was passed as a means to improve the uniformity of existing illegal dumping regulations, which are illegal dumping due to lack of following regulations, which endanger the public and the environment. There are 4 key provisions. This is really important. 4 key provisions under 29 CFR. And those are procedures and policies, materials, designation and labeling, packaging requirements, and then of course the operational rules. And we'll learn how to decipher this hazardous materials table. So sometimes I believe there's a little confusion about what is the overarching body here. So just like it's the Department of Labor, it's actually the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration within the Department of Transportation that manages the 4 key provisions and helps with enforcement. Ultimately, the act was put into place to protect the environment and human life because of the risk of incidents out in the environment when things are being transported, as well as to help prevent illegal spills and dumping. So we have 49 CFR parts 101, 106, 107 for procedures, part 172 for labeling, parts 173, 78, 79, and 80 for packaging requirements, and then the operational rules are 71, 73, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So under the Department of Health and Human Services is where you find rules for drugs, devices, cosmetics, and tobacco. And we will not look at that within this course. However, as you could imagine, the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting the health and safety, as well as ensuring the efficacy and security related to the use of devices, biological products, or medications and pharmaceuticals. And certainly there was a lot of targeting on the FDA, because in the beginning we were being administered vaccines that hadn't gone through the full rigor. That does not mean that they weren't safe, it's just they hadn't gone through the full rigor because we did not have time. So that's an example of where Department of Health and Human Services interacted with the Department of Labor. An entire class could be spent looking at the responsibilities of the EPA when it comes to hazardous materials. But the major acts would be, as we started to learn at the beginning of this class, the Comprehensive Emergency Response, Compensation, and Liabilities Act, which was then reauthorized, SARA, which was reauthorized, and that is our Superfund Act. This also added an entire Title 3 of SARA, which is Community Right to Know. So when we first begin our EPA journey, it's really the control of the materials before we even think about protecting the environment. Toxic Substance Control Act, that's where some of our nasties still are, and we hope that the chemicals we're using are not on this list. For if they are some of the worst violators. We've been already at least briefed on the Comprehensive Emergency Response and Liability Act, which was reauthorized as part of SARA. And so there is a great map that you can look at of the Superfund sites, as well as a list under TSCA for the different types of substances that you may need to have even further rules or regulations when they're on the nasties list. And I guess that's putting it somewhat simple, but some 30 years ago, that was the way that it was communicated to us, that there's some chemicals that are dangerous. There's some that are a step above dangerous, let's call them hazardous. And then there's those that can be mutagens or teratogens. So just looking further down the road, let's not forget that this Title III of SARA is Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know. The Toxic Substance Control Act of 1976 provides authority to EPA to require the reporting, tracking, record-keeping, testing, as well as to oppose restrictions on certain substances that are considered dangerous to the health or the environment. Polychlorinated biphenyls, asbestos, lead, these are some that were generally Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, RCRA, is the Cradle to Grave Act. It basically follows the liability of the generator, transporter, treatment, storage, disposal of the hazardous waste from the point of its creation to the point again of its disposal. And this prevents as much as possible the use of Superfund dollars. This typically is covered in a different course, but we will touch on it here. And then, just in case you were not quite ready for all the different kinds of acts, we have the Safe Drinking Water Act, Federal Water Pollution and Prevention Act, Pollution Prevention Act, Asbestos Hazardous Response Act of not only 86 but 1990, and then the Clean Air Act. And so after we've looked at all of that information, this is a good place to take a pause and start to think about the importance of the communities and the leadership within a local area to protect its citizens. So before SARA, in 1986, SARA was revised to add two important elements to the emergency planning and community right to know. It was to encourage and support emergency planning for responding to chemical incidents and to provide local government and the public with information about the chemicals that are within their community. And so there's four major sections. That's emergency planning, emergency notification of, again, an unplanned release, community right to know, which is the toxic inventory safety data sheets. It means that every company, organization in a community should have their safety data sheets available, and many of which, depending on which chemicals they are using, are reportable to their local, so that would be their local Department of Environmental Quality. And then, of course, there's toxic chemicals emissions reporting, and these are two different things. So emissions would be more of a planned release, where emergency notification is for that unplanned release. Title III Emergency Planning, there are four main elements, and the first one is to ensure that state and local communities are prepared to respond to potential chemical accidents through, and then it gave training, and there's FEMA money available and different kinds of grants, and lots of communities have taken advantage of this, and they've strengthened their local emergency planning committees, their LEPCs, and these are designated within each county to help with different elements inside of an emergency response. So, for example, when I was a public health director at Madison County, our LEPCs fed people. We had a food wagon. And some other things that might be part of your emergency response planning are being sure that you could have an all hazards plan, meaning your plan translates over whether it's a dam failure, road closure, multiple fatality, you have an evacuation, maybe some kind of hazardous weather event. And so each organization should really update these. And I thought it was really interesting that many organizations had pandemic plans, but they hadn't been updated in so long that it didn't keep pace with technology, right? So 15 years ago, we may have been sending a fax, but now everything is done through our phones. And so the third element is toxic chemical release and emissions inventory, and it requires industries, certain industries, whether it's by the nature of the industry or the chemical or agent that they're using, to inform the public routinely about something that has the potential to being released in the environment. And if it's on the toxic inventory list, then there's 31 chemicals and 68 specific chemicals for which the reporting rules are more stringent, and you have to report on a quarterly basis. And then number 4 is community right to know, and it's just basically increased awareness as well as giving the community the chance to design its response, or maybe move certain elements away from a site where it has the potential for a release to impact their community. And so although I'm going to read this, there's different definitions of what a hazardous material is. And so I really like the DOT version because it defines a hazardous material as any item or chemical which, when being transported or moved in commerce, is a risk to public safety or the environment and is regulated as such under its Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration regulation, which includes the Hazardous Regulation Materials Act. It's a lot more succinct than OSHA, which seems that it has to trip over itself with their definitions. So here we go. OSHA's definition includes any substance or chemical which is a health hazard or physical hazard, including chemicals such as carcinogens, toxic agents, irritants, corrosives, sensitizers, agents which act on a homeostatic system, agents such that cause damage to the lungs, eyes, skin, mucous membrane, chemicals which are combustible, explosive, flammable, oxidizers, pyphoric, unstable reactive, or water reactive, and maybe chemical reactive, which of course includes chemical reactive during normal handling, use, storage, and may produce or release dust, gas, fumes, vapors, mist, smoke, or any other thing that isn't previously mentioned. Oh my goodness. That is like, so let's just use the DOT version. Okay, the Department of Commerce. That's the hazardous materials that we use in our everyday life. And so one of your assignments will be to look up the safety data sheet of something that is just in your home, use all the time, such as this Drano. And so we do not discuss that as much in our course, but things that we use in our home are regulated under the Department of Commerce, under the Federal Hazardous Substance Act. And so, for example, it would have these different categories. Category 1B, skin corrosion. Category 1, serious eye damage. And as we get further into understanding the global harmonization system, we'll be able to look these up and see that we only use the same word. So we wouldn't use high danger or high alert, we just use danger. And that each one of these, for example, serious eye damage, category 1, causes serious eye damage. Those are all very specific to that category 1, depending on the damage that may be done. And so it seems redundant. It seems kind of somewhat silly. But if English wasn't your first language, or if we need to communicate the hazards that are similar, then we need to use exactly the same terminology. And so hazardous material legislation and governing rules depends on the industry, the quantity, the use, the production, the storage, and the disposal. And sometimes multiple acts can cover the same chemical at the same time. So in review, you could kind of see here where the Clean Air Act, that's really where we look at reducing levels of certain types of ambient particulate matter, whether it's PM 2.5 or PM 10, or the constituent itself, such as sulfur dioxide, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and lead. Horribly, we could see the waste, the Federal Water Pollution and Prevention Act. This is the Mississippi River, and the dead zone is because of all the runoff of agriculture wastes. And again, that would be covered under the Clean Water Act. And then we have RCRA, which looks at this, again, cradle to grave, who made it, generated it, transported it, treated it, disposed of it. And we're trying to reduce the amount of materials we have and also be sure that everybody is liable, that should be liable. So in Montana, we have this wonderful thing called the Berkeley Pit, and it is a Superfund site, as well as Libby, Montana was also another Superfund site. And so as we get to the end of these, just some scope on some of the most polluted places in the world, or maybe some polluted places right in our backyard. So we need agents that can be dangerous, but can we use something less dangerous, reduce the amount that's on site, control its release, recycle what we can, and that ultimately is the goal. So this is our overview. Please send questions. Thank you.